Um, so yeah, thanks a lot for having me here today. I'm really excited to be part of this conference. It's just first thing in the morning in Canada, so I'm looking forward to catching up on what you guys have been talking about throughout the day. Unfortunately, this talk isn't really about signal processing, but maybe it'll be, a little warm up to the rest of the session. I also have a newborn baby right next to me, so apologies. This might fill the soundscape today. So my name is Dr. Rachel Buxton. I'm a new assistant professor at Carleton University. A lot of my research is done in collaboration with the federal government, so Environment and Climate Change Canada. I did my previous postdoc at Colorado State University, where a lot of my research was done in collaboration with the National Park Service. I'm a conservation scientist, which means that really my ultimate goal is to use passive acoustic monitoring and the information that we get from recordings to address the real world problems that are facing biodiversity. Whoops. So biodiversity loss is occurring at an increasingly rapid rate. We're in the midst of a biodiversity crisis. And resources to conserve biodiversity are extremely limited. For example, in the United States, expenditure on endangered species is about 25% of what's needed for the full implementation of recovery programs. So given this reality, conservation programs face difficult decisions about which actions to prioritize over others. So when I talk about conservation actions, these are the things that are necessary to secure species from extinction. Things like habitat protection and population enhancement. But management decisions that are made in the absence of sufficient information can be inefficient or worse, actually undermine progress towards recovery. And it's research and monitoring that generate this information. The research and monitoring are important components of biodiversity conservation if the information is properly applied to inform action. However, research and monitoring beyond what's needed to make a management decision can waste limited conservation resources and reduce the amount of funding that's available for action. When you think of it, achieving conservation is really unlikely if most of our resources are allocated to research and monitoring, without any clear guidance about how the information collected is going to improve solutions or trigger actions. And unfortunately, our research is showing that large amounts of financial budgets are being allocated to research and monitoring. So in this study, we found that half of threatened species budgets are actually allocated to research and monitoring for species that are on the brink of extinction. And as a result of too many resources being allocated to research and monitoring, many local populations and species have been monitored until extinction. So here's a few examples. The one in the middle is the Christmas Island pipistrelle, which is noteworthy because here's a species that was on the brink of extinction, and yet there was an extensive acoustic monitoring program set up on Christmas Island to monitor echolocation calls until the last echolocation call was heard in 2009, and the species has not been observed since. So in this context, where does passive acoustic monitoring come in? Here's a nice, I don't know if you guys can hear this dawn chorus, but hopefully it's relaxing you on this lovely afternoon or morning, wherever you are. So passive acoustic monitoring is a cheap way of monitoring biodiversity. Advances in digital recording technology mean that recordings can be collected for long periods of time over large areas. Just to give you an example, the United States National Park Service have collected over 400 sites worth of recordings over the past 2 decades at national parks around the country. So it's an enormous amount of information to help us make conservation decisions. So what I'd like to do here is give you a couple examples from my own research where I used passive acoustic monitoring for conservation. And then I'll end with where I envision my new research lab at Carleton taking this field. So the first example is looking at how climate change causes shifts in songbird phenology. So climate change is causing earlier spring migration of songbirds. And these impacts of climate change are the most prominent in polar regions. However, monitoring and climate adaptation planning are particularly difficult in these regions because they're so remote. Typically, parks that are in polar regions will send out field crews to remote locations in order to monitor phenology. And this is extremely expensive. It can chew up large amounts of park budgets just trying to get this sort of information. So instead, we trialed soundscape recordings to capture phenology. We did this in collaboration with Glacier Bay National Park, which is in the panhandle of Alaska. This park is fairly remote, and there's some evidence that songbirds are arriving later and later in the spring. So we trialed acoustic recordings at 6 different sites around the bay. We wanted to do this as cheaply as possible. So when it came to the analysis, we wanted to use something really easy and affordable. So we trialed an acoustic index called the Acoustic Complexity Index. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, so I'm not going to spend much time on this, but we use the Acoustic Complexity Index to analyze recordings. This compares sound pressure levels between different frequency bands and also between different time steps. And we found that, well, first we wanted to look at whether or not this index is actually related to the richness of different songbird vocalizations and recordings. And indeed, we found that there was a positive and significant relationship between the richness of songbird vocalizations in recordings and ACI. And we also found a positive relationship between ACI and the abundance of common species calls. So in this case, that was the varied thrush up in Alaska. So we then looked at a Bayesian change point analysis to look at abrupt changes in ACI from winter into spring. And we found really prominent and significant spikes in acoustic complexity index at the onset of spring. And this corresponded to the arrival of common migratory songbird species. Interestingly, just over the few years that we were undertaking these recordings, we found that birds arrived 5 days earlier. So this was a really cheap method. We put out these recordings, we let them sit from winter into summer, and then we analyzed them using this ACI, which is relatively easy using our software. And so this takes a huge amount of financial burden off the park. They use this method today to monitor phenology of songbirds within the park, and they use it within their reporting. And it allows them to spend that money on other things like outreach to visitors and climate adaptation planning. So the second example is a project where we looked at the impacts of visitor noise on seabirds. This project was done in collaboration with park managers at Alcatraz Island and San Francisco Bay. This park sees millions of visitors annually. It's also home to Brandt's cormorants, which nest on the cliffs around the island and are particularly sensitive to human disturbance. So the park wanted to host a special exhibit, and it was decided that this building on the island would be open to the public. However, this particular building was adjacent to a cormorant colony, so the park put in shades on the windows to prevent visitors from being visible to the colony. But what park managers wanted to know was the effects of increased visitor noise on cormorants. So we created a before-after control impact design. We used recording devices paired with cameras at the colony before and after the building was open, and at another colony adjacent to a building where no visitors were allowed. So acoustic recorders assess the noise levels inside and outside the visited and unvisited buildings. And video footage collected at each colony allowed us to count the number of cormorants and assess different behaviors. So we found that disturbance type behavior, like taking off from the colony and wing fluttering, increased as visitor noise levels increased inside the visited building. Also, cormorants more readily flushed due to predatory gulls at the noisy building only. So some evidence that these birds are being affected by visitor noise inside the building. So because of these results, the park is now trialing something called quiet zones in this building and others on Alcatraz. This is a really simple technique that other parks have employed. They put up a sign designating a site a quiet area, asking visitors to appreciate the park quietly, and it actually works. So it's known to decrease visitor noise significantly within these areas. So there's a couple examples from my research. Acoustic monitoring, it can be a key tool to monitor biodiversity for conservation. But I think the question really remains, how much information is enough when it comes to biodiversity conservation? As I mentioned, we're facing a biodiversity crisis, and there's always going to be uncertainty. So we only need enough information to make better decisions. And you can figure out how much information you need using decision-making approaches. So one of these approaches is called a value of information approach. It's an economic approach that quantifies the upper limit of how much money is worth investing in information gain before just making a management decision. So I think in the context of acoustic recordings, this would be a really interesting approach to employ. Also, there are a perplexing number of tools and indices to analyze soundscapes. So we did a literature review and we found over 30 acoustic indices that are commonly used to analyze acoustic recordings. And it seems that everybody uses something different. In this case, we used all of the indices put together in a random forest approach. But again, the question really remains, what type of analytical tools are the most effective to answer different conservation questions, to get at that important conservation information? And with that, I'll leave it there. I'll leave my contact information up if you'd like to get in touch and ask any questions that I don't have time to answer today. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I can see there is already a question in the chat. So Carly, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, I was just wondering what type of acoustic recorders you were using for these projects, like audio moths, song meters, etc.
Yeah, so for the Glacier Bay project, we were using song meters. And for the project on Alcatraz Island, I'll have to look it up, but we were using really old recording devices because they were put out by the Park Service a while ago. So while we're chatting, I'll look that up for you.
And if anyone has a question they want to ask you, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, if you have a question here. I thought the idea of this huge data collection that you mentioned by the national parks in the US, it's amazing. And I know in Australia they're also collecting over hundreds of sites all over across Australia. And it's just I guess this is a big part of this session is how do you deal with such an amount of data? And as you said, if we spend so much allocate so much resources into the monitoring part, we miss out on a lot of the conservation implications. So that was a really well put.
Yeah, I think it's something that we get caught up on as ecologists and biologists. We want to know, we want to answer questions, we want to know more information. And then, you get these large scale recordings and you want to glean all this information from them. You want to know, exactly how many of each bird was calling and, what the patterns are throughout the day and season. But really, if you're thinking it from a biodiversity conservation perspective, do we need to know all that information? Or would that energy be better spent elsewhere on, answering questions that are relevant to conservation? So I think it's just something to keep in mind as we move forward with signal processing. What type of information are we trying to extract from these recordings? And is it useful information? For speaking from it from a conservation perspective, just keeping that in mind. And to the person who asked what recording devices, the one on the type on Alcatraz Island was an Olympus recorder.
So is that, are they autonomous recorders? I don't know.
Sorry?
Are they autonomous type of recorders or?
Yeah.
So thank you very much. You can, if you come up with more questions, we can also have them in the discussion.
Great.
Thank you so much, and it was lovely to hear all the birds and your baby going.
All right. Thanks, guys.